Greetings again from the Ohio Lodge of Research. I am David Doherty, current master of the Lodge. In the Ohio Lodge of Research, we have the opportunity to make a lot of great connections. Today, I have the opportunity to speak with Brother Chris Ruli, author of the new book from McCoy Publishing, The Whitehouse and the Freemasons. He recently presented this topic to the Ohio Lodge of Research, and a recording of his presentation is available on our website, and I'll also provide a link in the description below. In this conversation, however, Brother Ruli shares some of his tips on research and the challenges of writing a book. I hope you enjoy the conversation that we have. I appreciate you doing this. I really did enjoy your presentation the other night,
Thank you.
And I had the opportunity to learn a little bit about you through our communication and through our through the presentation and so forth.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of this, tell our viewers about yourself, Masonically speaking. How did you become a Mason? Why are you still active? How long have you been a Mason? Whatever you want to share.
Sure. So I joined Freemasonry through a personal friend of mine who I sort of met when I was in high school, actually. It was my music teacher. He, every first Wednesday or second Wednesday, I can't seem to remember now. It's turning into myth and legend. But every second or first Wednesday, he would show up with his Masonic ring. I didn't realize what it was. I was like, he wears this ring. That's so interesting. What is that? And he was a trumpet player. So obviously when you have the trumpet in front of you, the ring is very visible. You can see it. And so we were all, in the music class together. And one of those days towards the end of my, high school career, I sort of just asked him, so what's the deal with this ring that you wear? And he was sort of shy about it. And he said, oh, I'm a Freemason. And I joined because of family, blah 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 blah. And so I learned a little bit about the fraternity that way. I didn't know anything about it. I heard stuff on TV. This was the time when National Treasure and all these big, the book about from Dan Brown came out, and so there was certainly the public was well aware of the organization's existence, but they didn't necessarily know. I certainly didn't necessarily know anything as a kid going into college. And so I didn't really do much about it or with it. I took that information and went off to college, went off to the Peace Corps. I served in Senegal as a Peace Corps volunteer. I then returned to the United States. I got my I went to a grad school program. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C., which was about more than 10 years ago now, to start my professional career, I was looking for a social outlet. I was wondering, what could I do? And through that, I sort of remembered, oh yeah, this Masonic thing. I remember something about it. And so I engaged and I reached out to a Masonic lodge in the District of Columbia that was very interested in history, that was very interested in ritual proficiency and all the sort of things that, Masons or candidates are looking for. And so I started the process. I became a candidate. I went through the initiatic degrees. And then there was a moment in time when I didn't really know what to do with Freemasonry, because I sort of finished the third degree and I go, okay, what's next? And what do I do? And my work as a statistician and healthcare, it sort of molded me in terms of what I was interested in doing. And I tend to travel a lot. And so I sort of was looking to find things to do. And then one day while in the lodge room, I realized that the closet that our lodge had, which had a ton of stuff in it, it was unorganized, it was dirty, it was collecting dust. And so I realized that was the lodge's archives. And so I started to go through the lodge's archives and say, well, would you mind if I go in there and clean it up a little and organize it and make it somewhat presentable? And perhaps there might be an interesting program through it. And so, the worshipful master said, of course, feel free. No one's touched it in forever. Feel free to go in and take a look at it and examine it. And that started my process or my interest in history. I dove into the records. I realized that the stuff wasn't digitized. So I took the initiative to digitize the lodge's records. I started to compile histories and research. And, you know, my mother lodge is a little unique because it's the lodge that um, is a steward of George Washington's gavel, the gavel that George Washington used to lay the cornerstone of the Capitol building. Excuse me. And so there was already Masonic history there, but I really dove into it to catalog, to document, to really sort of open the door. And then through that research, I met a lot of Masons who are interested in history. By virtue of being in the District of Columbia, I met a lot of interesting Masons who maybe worked at the House of the Temple or the George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Virginia. And so I just started to really dive into the work, tried to find things that I could found interesting, research topics and ideas. I started to publish and write a lot. And then as I, was going up through the various affiliated bodies, I continued to publish and write work and research and publish not just about Blue Lodge Masonry or about history, but of Royal Arch and the York Rite Knights Templar. And then over time, I got involved in the Grand Lodge. I became the Grand Historian and Grand Librarian of the Grand Lodge of DC. Did a lot of research, and collecting and organizing and managing their records and archives. And it really just, it went from there. And then, as we mentioned in our last conversation, I took a lot of materials that I used when I was serving as Grand Historian and Librarian. I compiled that, and then that created this first book that I was working on, which is The Whitehouse and the Freemasons. So it sort of stemmed from, it became this, interest, curiosity, you would say, of a person that I really appreciated and respected, my old music teacher. And then over time, when I had the time to do it and the commitment to do it, I got into Freemasonry. I found an opportunity where there wasn't really an opportunity to do some research and to dive into the history. And that blossomed into, I think, a pretty interesting and exciting Masonic career.
Wow. Wow. And you kind of, one of the things, I can't remember if I asked it or not, but I was like, how have you stayed active? Because I think that's one of the things that we often see, regardless of where your lodge happens to be, is that we get a lot of people that join and then just kind of fade away. And, they lose that interest. And I mean, I don't want to answer for you, but it sounds like you found a passion and that has just kept you fueled.
I think I found the passion based on a need. And I think a lot of Masons, well, no, I shouldn't generalize, but I should say the Masons that are good friends of mine, that I enjoy spending time with, some of those brothers have not attended lodge meetings in years, but they find ways to contribute to the lodge. And so if they can't, for example, serve as an officer, well, they may participate in one or two events that year that are important events. They may perform or serve in a degree cast, or they may attend a special festive board, perhaps for St. John's, where that's an event that we know that it's happening and then we can participate in. And so, some of these folks that I know, great brethren that I know, can't contribute every day, but they find ways to contribute. My contribution was solely based on the fact that the lodge needed someone to do a project, like clean up the lodge's archives or digitize the lodge's archives. And so I think there are great opportunities for Masons who are interested in history to do the same thing. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that there are plenty of lodge archives that are just collecting dust, or perhaps your lodge doesn't know where all your minutes are, or perhaps there's a secretary who has their minutes in the garage or in their basement, and they're just collecting dust and they haven't been looked at or reviewed. And to me is an opportunity to go in there, take those archives, digitize them, make them useful for future generations.
You came into this topic of the presidents and the White House and all of that somewhat organically because you found this this closet full of stuff, basically.
I found a closet that contained minutes and records and letters and correspondence and items and like coins and all these different sorts of things. And so One of the things that I wanted to do was find the relevancy. Is there something here that can connect with people? My thing with writing anything, my thing with communicating with anybody is there has to be a little bit of value. Why am I communicating to this? Why is it? And you might find something that you're very interested in and you want to communicate it, but the best way to do that is find a way that it's meaningful to somebody else. So for you and I, David, we may not necessarily come from the same background. We certainly don't have the same technical skills, but we find something that there's common within both of us that we may appreciate, like history. And so my job, or the job of someone who's interested in writing history or communicating, is to find a way to, how is it meaningful for somebody else? How is it meaningful for a general audience? Perhaps how is it meaningful for your spouse or your family member, or for a lodge in general? And so I tried to, whenever I write or do Masonic research, I try to think of who is my audience? Is my audience every Mason in the entire world? Great. How do I develop a communication strategy or research that helps that person understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, once you know who your audience is, then you know what story you want to tell as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, no, that
Absolutely.
makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. So how long did it take you? I mean, if you can put a date to it, how long did it take you from your original idea of, hey, there's actually something here I want to research, to
Yeah.
I have a book that I'm going to publish?
Well, we're recording this in November, and so I would say about the upcoming February will be year 6 or year 7 of this project. So I've been working on this specific project, this book, Whitehouse and the Freemasons, for about 7 years now, and it is a culmination of a lot of different phases of research. And I mentioned it before in our previous talk for the Lodge of Research, that initially I thought this was going to be a really great research paper. And I thought, well, it'll be a nice research paper that I can write, it might be 8 or 9 pages, and then I could publish it in one of the great, Masonic research papers. But over time, as I developed more resources, I pulled more primary resources and all that stuff. And I actually have a process in which how I did it, and I'm happy to share that with you. As I went through that process of initial discovery and writing and drafts, and I realized that this is not just a 9 or 10 page research paper. This is a book that could be shared with others.
So what, if you, I don't know how quickly or briefly you can do it, but what is that process that you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, so I sort of have it in different phases. So I have 3 phases. I have the pre-writing phase, the phase where you're actually collecting information, then the writing phase, and then the phase that we don't really talk about a lot as researchers is the communication phase. And I think it's just as important. So for the first phase, it's that pre-writing phase. It's about setting, the first thing you do before anything is actually setting a goal or a plan. You have to set a plan or a goal for what you want to communicate. And so to me, the hypothesis, the goal, the idea that I was looking for was I wanted to communicate to people about the history between the Whitehouse and the Freemasons. That was the goal. That was what I tried to communicate. And at the end of the day, regardless of what the item is that I produce and give to you, that at the end of that session or after you read the paper or the book, you'll say, okay, I learned a little something about this topic. That was the goal. The second thing I did is write an outline. So the outline may not necessarily be what the paper or the book will be out, but it's about thinking about yourself, thinking about how do you want to organize your thoughts. And so once you have the overall goal and you say, I want to think about the Whitehouse and the Freemasons, the next thing is, well, how do you attack this question? So is it, I want to look at primary resources? Do I want to just look at the main presidents of the United States, or Masonic presidents, or do I want to look at everyone? And so these are the types of questions you should ask for yourself. And then by outlining, writing down an outline of what you think are the things you want to cover, that will help you get to the next part, which is the collection. So identifying resources, primary resources, secondary resources. And so the next step in that process then is say, great, I know what I'm talking about. I know what the focus of what I'm going to talk about is going to be. So then where do I get that information? And so that is a search through Masonic resources like Masonic proceedings. You can find online resources. I'm a fan of the humanities website JSTOR, and I'm not sure if you're familiar for that, but JSTOR is a academic database of journals in the humanities and the social sciences. JSTOR. It's a great academic research. If you have an alumni email address, or whoever has, if you have an alumni address, you may be able to utilize, a lot of schools have partnerships with JSTOR where you can get access to it for free. And then there's a lot of online, so Internet Archive, Internet Database has a lot of old PDFs and old Masonic documents that you can use. There's a really good UGLE, or not, it may not be in the UGLE, but it's certainly an international, I would say, conglomerate of Masonic PDF research papers called the Count Calistrago Database, and you can Google it online, or we can provide links with this podcast as well. And that has about 30 to 40,000 PDFs related to Masonic books and research and documents. Most of them are things that are out of print or out of copyright, which means that you can get the full copies in a PDF form. And so regardless of, what I was working on, depending on your topic, you might find those resource or primary resources, secondary resources helpful. I know for my research, for example, I loved using newspapers.com, and this is not a, sponsored content for them. I don't get paid from them, but based on how many years I've used them, they're a really great resource because you can pull newspapers related to your town, your country. I mean, globally, they even have now more international newspapers. And so I was able to find a lot of, interactions and engagements with the presidents of the Freemasons that way. It's also just good a resource. Newspapers.com is just a good resource if you are attempting to collect information about your local lodge or your local Grand Lodge, because newspapers, covered a lot of these things. The next thing I did in that process, and this is something that, I took me probably a while to figure out, was how do I want to present this? So again, was it a book? Was it a research paper? And so sometimes you may not realize, or you may not know what the end goal is, because you may not know what resources there are out there. And so to me, it was a function of, okay, how much do I have? And that took me a while to collect. And so what I would do is I would create a Word document or a Google document or a blank document. And basically, whenever I went through these resources, these primary and secondary resources, I'd write a little note to myself and say, oh, this diary has information on XYZ, or these 14 newspaper clippings give me all this information. And so this was not before I started writing. I would just collect all my thoughts and things onto a Word document or a Google document. And I would force myself to not go through the writing process. It was just more of like, let's collect as much information on this topic as possible before thinking about writing. So that really ends that first phase, which is set up a goal, figure out your resources, put all those notes and things that you have into one step. So that's the pre-writing phase. The writing phase is perhaps the most daunting, certainly for people who write or who don't write professionally. That certainly is a daunting aspect. And so that's where you write your traditional, quote unquote, traditional outline. How are you going to start your project? How are you going to, what's the middle of your project going to be? What's the ending going to look like? And by the way, this is a function of not just a book. This is a function of a research paper. This is a function of a PowerPoint presentation with slides. How are you going to organize your slides? How are you going to organize your resources that make sense? The way that I did it was I just started by writing out an outline and saying, here's the first section, here's the second section, here's the third section, and then started to fill in all that information. And Dave, please tell me if this is too general. I can go get a little bit more technical, but I figured this is for people who are curious to know. They're starting off and they're trying to figure it out.
No, this is great. Yeah.
Okay. So in this writing phase, and when you're writing out your outline, this is where you are explicitly clear in saying, well, here are the sections for my PowerPoint slide, or here are the sections for my research paper, or here are the section or the chapters of my book. And you lay them out as well as you can, and realizing that these might change over time. You might move things around, you might condense and consolidate. That's okay. That's not it's not necessarily the point to get it down and set it in stone. The point is to help you think of your thoughts and go with your thoughts as you're going through it. And so writing an outline is not only helpful for you, but it's also a map of your argument. What does that mean? Well, if you're doing a presentation or a research paper, you should lay out your argument in the beginning of the paper. And you should say, in this, not necessarily say it as directly as I'm saying it, but you have to find a way of saying, in this paper, I'm going to solve this question or answer this question. And hopefully you'll go through the rest of the paper giving examples or rationale or reasons as to how you're going to do that and how you do that. And so that's the pre-writing phase. And then what I did was I just attacked every single chapter, just slowly but surely. I went to every single chapter and worked on every single chapter. I started with chapter 1. I did not focus on chapters 5, 6, and 7. I just sat there and wrote a small research paper for every single chapter. So if I had 10 chapters in a book, I wrote 1,000 or so words for one chapter and kept going and kept going and kept going. And so I don't consider myself writing. So when people write a book, let's say, I don't consider myself writing one book. I consider myself writing 10 research papers. And it's just basically cut off into certain times or dates or themes, depending on what your book or your research paper is working on. And so mine was easy, right? So when I was working on the Freemasons and the presidents, I just organized them by administration. And I said, well, for George Washington, and this first set of guys, I'm going to work on this, and that's going to be the chapter, and I'm going to put all my attention on that. And I let everything else, be held off until I get to that chapter, or get to that administration. You might not be able to do that, but depending on the topic that you're working, try your focus to write as much as you can. When I'm not thinking about writing, I was thinking about writing. I know that sounds contradictory, but it was one of these things where if I'm doing my own work or I'm at work, at my job, my day job, and I'm thinking of something and something strikes in my mind, I run off and write a little note to myself and say, oh, for chapter 4, something I didn't think about because I haven't gotten to chapter 4 yet. Go to chapter 4, write this little note that says, oh, make sure you remember XYZ, or make sure you were watching something, or you're reading something, or you saw something on TV that mentioned that George Washington did XYZ. So I'd run off and make a note to myself for those different chapters. And that helped me as well. That the process isn't over when you get to that first part and you're done with your chapter. Now, when hopefully you've gone through now, you're writing. And one of the things that you'll need to learn or need to remember is I strongly encourage you to take 2 or 3 passes at writing a paper. I do not publish a paper, or I do not publish a book. I don't publish even a PowerPoint slides for a presentation without going through and doing at least 2 or 3 iterations of a revision. So that means I start from the first page and I go to the last page, and then I do it again after I'm done 2 or 3 times. What I've realized, and this is just personally me, this is how I work, and perhaps someone else is different, but in different points of my life or different times when I'm reading, I'll go back to my work and go, I don't understand why I wrote that. That sounds terrible. That looks terrible, or that's not really great. And so by going over and doing a revision with yourself, it actually helps you think, is there a better way to write this? Is there an easier way to write this? And really focusing on being concise and as direct as possible. One of the style choices that a lot of people make that I notice is people write very flowery language. And so my attempt, as always, and that's just because I'm a statistician at heart, is to be concise and clear. Regardless of I don't like to I don't like to involve flowery language or descriptive language unless it's very necessary. So for example, if I'm describing what a cornerstone ceremony looks like, then I think it's important to add a little descriptive. But if you're just giving facts and information, I try to be as concise as possible. When I'm done with that, that's really the sort of towards the end of the second phase, which is still this writing phase. Now, if you want a very good paper, that makes sense, and if you want a very good paper that is worthy to be shared with others, you must share it with others first. And so peer review is an extremely, extremely, extremely important part of this process. And I think peer review does two things. It allows you to have someone else take a look at it and bring in their concepts and their perspectives and their feedback. At the same time, it makes you a better writer because it allows you to open yourself up to criticism, to commentary, to, hey, why, Chris, why didn't you write this down? Or why haven't you considered this? Oh, by the way, I know an author who wrote this topic in a different research journal. Consider to look. So again, it allows you to, it opens your heart and opens your mind up to good reception and criticism, and it allows you to become a better writer, and a better researcher. And it allows you to work with others. And I think that's important as well. No book is published solely for you. It's published for other people. And so whenever I see someone who writes a book and has not sent it to peer review or hasn't shared it with a friend or family member to review it, I think is doing a disservice, because what they're doing is they're writing their own perspectives, but not asking for anyone else's commentary. And who does that in the world? Who lectures without ever getting any feedback as a professor or whoever, in your job, if you work with a team, who in their right mind orders someone to do something and never gets any feedback from it? There is this feedback process in life. And so I think that's important to do. Now, if you're interested in writing a book, please consider paying for a professional editor or professional editing service. There are freelance editors that will do it for you. They are fantastic. You can even reach out to local universities' English departments, and they can also find individuals or staff or faculty who can assist you in that process. So consider having a professional editor, because a professional editor can cut through a lot of the grammatical and prose mistakes that you may have. Even the best authors in the world have editors. I hate to tell you, but Stephen King has an editor. His first draft is terrible, I can guarantee you, but he has very good editors that can go through the review and make sure that it comes out and it's a best-selling New York Times book. And then the last phase in this process, we went from pre-writing to writing to this third phase, which is the communication phase. I think the communication phase is just as important. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you are writing your book, but are you also you have to now synthesize your book. You have to cultivate it in a way that you have to be your expert on your writing. So what I'm saying is you have to review your work and synthesize it in such a way that you can explain it to someone in 10 seconds, in a minute, in 30 minutes, and in an hour. So, I've probably done more work now after I've written my book, going out to lodges of research like yourself in Ohio or New Jersey or Pennsylvania or Florida or Texas, and meeting with Masons and talking to them about the book, telling them why it's important, figuring out what are the key points, maybe 5 or 6 key points, and then talking about those key points. And so once you're done with something, once you're done with a paper, once you're done with a book, you have to really go out and communicate the values and the reason why it's an important book, or why it's new or it's different and it's useful for people. And so there's a lot in that process. So I'm going to stop talking now.
Great. I think the way you put everything together, and you actually answered a lot of my questions along the way, and you kind of included a lot of that in there. And I think you're absolutely right on the two points in particular that I wanted to bring up that I agree with, that I think that you hit on, were getting other people's viewpoints. I think that all too often we are guilty, especially as Masons, especially people who are not in this research writing area traditionally, is that they just kind of reach a point and say, I'm done, and set it off, and that's the end of it.
Yes.
And I think, I know myself, I have, 2 or 3 people that I can send things to and say, all right, pretend that I'm stupid, tell me what I've done wrong, and read this. But I think you hit on the big point, is that there's a level of trust that has to exist there. And I think that's a very valuable part of that. And then the other side of that is the communication. I would have to believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I would have to believe that this time where you're going out and talking to people about what you've written, that's the fun part, right? That's where you get to see how it all comes together.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. It's the part where it's the point of self-reflection, I like to call it, where you are now reflecting on your work. You are looking at 6 years worth of work, 6 years worth of work, and you're seeing it synthesized into a minute of conversation, or into
Yeah.
30 minutes of conversation, or into an hour of conversation. And so I think that's very difficult to do, especially, it's sort of like, I know it's not very much the same, but it's sort of like, how do you explain a relationship with someone that you've known for 5 years, and how do you boil that down into maybe a couple paragraphs? It really is difficult to do. And so I think once you've completed all that work and it's exciting, now the real work begins of trying to communicate it to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining us for our conversation with Brother Chris Ruli on the topic of Masonic research. I believe there was a lot of useful and productive information that was shared in this conversation, and hope that you can use it as you begin your Masonic research or continue your Masonic research and bring it to fruition.